Hey, Honor, would you sing that song you've been singing?
I would have dinner with you.
No music on the podcast. Okay, only talking. Only talking sounds. No music, no singing, no instruments. Only normal volume mouth conversation.
You're disqualified then, because why are you yelling at me?
Welcome to Podcast Cast. Hello, and welcome to Podcast Cast. It's a podcast where we talk about other podcasts. I'm Sam.
I'm Honor. You said that different than you normally do.
Do I need to restart?
No, I think it's funny. I just wanted to point out that you were wrong.
I've never been wrong before, and I'm not wrong now. And you know who else isn't wrong? Our guest, Marissa. Hi, Marissa.
Hi.
Hello.
Marissa, we're glad you're on because you and me were talking before the show. You listen to podcasts that we don't usually listen to.
I think so.
You're a big true crime person, right?
Mm-hmm.
You told me you listen to Crime Junkie.
Mm-hmm.
Which is all I know is that's the big crime one. That's the one I see in the Apple like top charts after Tucker Carlson. You know, I see Crime Junkie, and you're gonna bring us another pod that we don't usually listen to. Mm-hmm. Marissa, you know we usually listen to. We have a lot of audio dramas.
Mm-hmm.
I've been getting into. Can I call it girly podcasts, Honor? Is that allowed?
I mean,
is that unprofessional?
When have we ever been professional?
We're very professional. I'm wearing a suit right now.
We're all wearing suits.
It's like clown suits that are like way too big.
Well, I don't know that there's such a thing as a clown suit, Honor.
Literally, there
There is.
What is it? Wait, what?
Like a little.
Think of a clown.
Are you not
Think
looking
of
at our
the
outfits?
suits that they wear.
Well,
it's like the big baggy pants. They got like the funny ties.
See, you mean like just a clown costume?
Clown suit is what they call it.
I thought you meant like a suit.
This is why you're wearing one, because you thought it was normal, but actually that's a clown suit.
Is this not what I'm supposed to wear
No.
to job interviews?
No.
Is that why I've not been?
No, I think the polka dots might work to refract light, like bike vests.
Yeah.
It's like a hazard
side. What after that? What happens after that, Honor?
You scare them off.
Speaking of scared off, listener, if you're still here, we've got some good pods to talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start off with a pod that I've been meaning to talk about for a long time, which is SmartLess. Have either of you heard of SmartLess?
No.
SmartLess is a celebrity interview podcast by celebrities.
Oh. So just like Famous People Club.
Yeah. I like that. Oh, like you were falling from the sky as you realized that. Oh, yeah, no, it's true. It's a podcast hosted by Will Arnett, Jason Bateman, and Sean Hayes. Will Arnett and Jason Bateman starred in Arrested Development, great show that I like. Sean Hayes was in Will and Grace, but I always think he's the third brother from Arrested Development. So the podcast is a celebrity interview podcast, and the premise is that these three dudes who are friends and famous and actors, they're going to do a celebrity interview podcast where only one of them knows the celebrity that they're interviewing. So every one of them gets to bring in a guest and then like introduces them to the rest of the crew. So they always start off not knowing. They give this big long intro. They're like, this guy has won 30 Golden Globes and 5 Nobel Peace Prizes. It's Hugh Jackman, and they're all like, oh my God, Hugh Jackman, we love you, right? And then they interview this person, not prepared, right? It's kind of different than most of, I think, what the like press junket for famous people is like, where they're like, oh, tell us about this movie you're promoting. Instead, this one is just like, how many cats did you have growing up? Are you tall? That's like a lot of the questions,
That's awesome.
It's pretty good. So I think this podcast is really different than most of the press that famous people do in that none of these guys are really prepared to ask them questions. Okay, that's not true. There's one person who knows that they're coming on the podcast, and they frequently have questions written up. but the other two don't. And it's not really like a normal conversation, you know, like there's those podcasts which is like me just hanging out talking to other dudes, you know what I mean? Like Joe Rogan comes to mind. Yeah. He's not like really an interviewer so much as he is just like, man, you ever see those birds? You know, this is not that. They're trying to interview them, and it's confusing. It's confusing. I have listened to this a bunch. I quite enjoyed this podcast. It's very funny. The first episode I listened to was one my brother sent me, which is one where Will Ferrell, famous comedian Will Ferrell, came on for Christmas and just pretended to be Santa Claus the whole time.
That's awesome.
It was great because he was like, God, it's such a hassle. I got these elves breathing down my neck. Mrs. Claus says I need to work overtime to pay the bills. We don't even have a mortgage, you know? And Will Ferrell is just so funny that he can keep it up for 30 minutes, and it's a really good time. But I was listening to more recent episodes where the hosts as interviewers is more prominent. So recently they interviewed Will Bargatze, who is a stand-up comedian. He's very good. You might know him from his SNL sketch, like what George Washington is fighting for in the Revolutionary War. It's like, I believe in our future country that we'll have our own system of weights and measures.
Yep. Why 12 inches? Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. They have an episode where they interview Nate Bargatze, and when Nate Bargatze is very funny, all three of the hosts do not really know how to interact with him. It's really tough because they're just asking him any questions to get any ground to like start a conversation, and it's so painful because you can tell like nothing's really taking. Like you keep thinking the episode's almost over because they have nothing to talk about, but it keeps going.
Oh,
yeah, that was a little tough of a listen to. On the other hand, I just listened to an episode of Hugh Grant, and that episode was great. They were mostly because Hugh Grant was just saying crazy things. He's like, I'm married to a giant Swede. She hurts me, you know, and they're like, this is hilarious. And they keep being like, so Will Grant, why don't you have any underwear? He's like, I forgot them at home, you know. And that's a lot funnier and a lot more interesting. And I think it's almost entirely because of the guest. So I think SmartLess is a good pod. A lot of people like it. It's a very popular podcast. But I think it has this problem where the three hosts are actors, and they're not particularly good interviewers. They're not very good at being like, because they don't research ahead of time. They don't really have great questions to ask, so they fall back a lot on like really long rambling questions. So they're like, so you know how they're, you know, in our industry, in the acting industry, there's women who have felt, you know, pigeonholed because they're so beautiful. Hugh Grant, you're very beautiful and you've maintained your looks very well, and I don't mean to insult you, but do you think, and this doesn't have to be, if you want to answer it, this is all up to you, but do you think that you've been in some sense only been contained to the rom-com because you yourself are a very beautiful man who I envy? What do you think about that? You know, it's these questions that they're trying to find something as they're going, and it's not great.
I feel like I don't want to listen to this podcast. I just want to listen to you recreate this podcast.
The new podcast spin-off pod, Smartful.
Yeah.
Where Sam just imitates every episode of SmartLess he hears.
Yep.
But, you know, they have these, you know, they're trying to come up with questions on the fly, and I think it really depends on the guest how good of a question it was, right? Hugh Grant will be like, oh, yes, I've been thinking about my career for some time now, and I think I've finally reached the weird part of it, you know? Whereas Nate Bargatze's like, that's all I want. Yeah, no, I like Applebee's. That's good. It's good for you. Go to a lot of chain restaurants, you know? And it's just nothing's happening there.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a weird podcast that like kind of sells itself as this is a celebrity interview podcast, but they're not really great celebrity interviewers. So my experience with SmartLess is very hit or miss, and there is a lot of you know, I hate to say the word because it feels cringe to say, but cringe. You know, there's a lot of cringy moments where you're like, ugh, these people are like really trying to get like a sound bite or something interesting out of it. But it's kind of hard, when there isn't a great, they don't jive really well. Sometimes it's great, really. If there's a funny person or famous person that you like and you've listened to other interviews for, listen to the SmartLess interview. It'll be good. You'll get to hear Daisy Ridley talk about how she was like, I'm never going to have a career in acting. And I was working at a pub, and then they were like, do you want to be Star Wars? And she was like, yeah, and so in that way, it's kind of fun, but a lot of times it's hit or miss. So I was a little, in some respects, let down by SmartLess in that way. But in other ways, I really like Will Arnett and Jason Bateman. Sean Hayes is okay. They have a great, yeah, I know. I hate to leave it out. Sean Hayes he's fine. I don't really. Well, the three of them have a pretty good chemistry, but the chemistry is mostly relying on Jason and Will just being mean to Sean.
Oh, okay.
He's just like, they were like interviewing someone, and they're like, there's ultimately we're actors and we live in the entertainment industry, and if you're not entertaining people, what are you doing? And Will goes, yeah, Sean, can you speak to that? Very funny.
It is.
I think
very funny.
Will Arnett's probably the funniest of the three of them. He has a great comedic sense, and they have good enough chemistry together. But the core of the chemistry is making fun of Sean, which is
that's pretty good.
Also sometimes uncomfortable. You're like,
yeah,
poor little guy, but you're like, it was funny.
It was funny.
So that's SmartLess in a nutshell. It's a very popular podcast, but for me, it doesn't kind of come to fruition. It doesn't. You're not like, whoa, every one of these episodes are a banger, and even the ones that are pretty good aren't the greatest. That being said, this podcast made me laugh out loud. It's a good, funny podcast.
That's good.
I just don't know that it's going to enter my rotation for comedy podcasts.
Gotcha.
That's where it's at for me.
What's the rating then?
Probably a 3.5 out of 5.
That's higher than I kind of expected.
Yeah,
from what you said.
I was kind of relatively negative in my review, but it should be said that there's a baseline interesting dynamic between the hosts.
We've said before on the podcast that if there's people who are entertainers, they have a podcast, most of the time it's entertaining.
This is true.
If there's funny people, they're good at being funny.
They are good at being funny. They are not great celebrity interviewers.
Yeah.
So that kind of holds it a little bit back. This podcast really does thrive off just the forces of personality of the hosts alone and the guests from time to time. So, SmartLess is okay. It's a popular podcast, but I don't know if it's that great. Anna, what pod you been listening to, dude?
That was so succinct. I just feel like I should congratulate you on that. Mine might be a little less succinct, but I listened to a podcast that I think you said yours was very popular, but I haven't heard of it. I think mine might be similar, where it's pretty popular if you're in the right circles.
That's Honor. I might say that might be all of your podcasts.
That might be all of my podcasts.
All of the podcasts are you're like, these are really well-known podcasts.
Yeah.
For Honor. You know these really well. Your circle, they fit in perfectly.
Yeah, if you're in the circle of nerds and weirdos, probably heard of this one.
I almost guarantee I have not.
Yeah. This is a podcast called 36 Questions. And it's slightly older. It's from, I believe, 2017. It's either 17 or 19. But has a stellar cast. This cast is primarily 2 people. There's technically 4 voices. 1, Jessie Shelton, where people would know her from, is she's one of the Fates on the original Broadway cast of Hadestown.
Okay. This is a very famous play that I have not seen.
Musical. So
That's
really showing your lack of knowledge there.
Musicals are plays. Okay, let's not split.
Not true.
What the hell are you guys talking about?
Not true.
A musical is a type of play. It is a subcategory.
It's a type of theater. But
there's also,
but they function extremely differently.
They are the exact same thing.
No,
because some of them are recorded, like the new Wicked.
That's still a musical.
It's a musical movie.
That's a musical movie. I'm saying even within the realm of theater, a play and a musical operate very differently because the role of music and dance and everything means that the stage is set up in different ways. There's a lot to get into, and you're going to get angry theater kids in the comments.
Yeah.
I think all the theater kids will agree with me because
I think you're about to get. I think you're about to get torn apart.
It happens on a stage. People are playing parts. That is a play.
No, that's theater.
You clearly never did speech and debate in one-act plays.
Yeah. Are you going to say a song and a podcast are the same thing?
No.
You listen to them in your ears?
You listen to them?
Guys.
You listen to them?
This is crazy. You guys are being crazy right now. What are you talking about?
You're
podcast,
crazy.
People are talking, and a song, people are singing. This
Sometimes
is very
people talk in songs, too.
Sometimes people talk
in songs. It depends. If they talk more than they sing, that's a little bit of a podcast, you know?
Uh-huh.
Could be a rap, maybe, you know?
That's the exact same way that a musical and play is. Anyways, you'll probably hear from my sister in particular. She could really tell you about the difference because she's also the person who recommended this podcast to me. So shout out to her. She was like, hey, this is a really cool podcast. And it was. But second person on the cast is Jonathan Groff, even more well-known Broadway actor. Primarily he was King George on Hamilton. He's also Kristoff in Frozen. He's done a lot of things. There's two other voices, technically speaking. One of them is a child who you hear in the third act, because it's an act, because, spoiler alert, it's a musical podcast. And the other voice is Henry the Duck. It's so awesome.
Is it a real? Is that a real duck?
It's a real duck. Henry is not the name of the actor Duck. I'm very sorry, I don't remember his name. I think it's something funny. It's like Sweetie Boy or something. Oh. Yeah, it's very sweet. In the credits, there are 4 people listed. It's Jesse Shelton, Jonathan Groff, the kid who I don't remember the actor's name. Sorry, and they credit the duck because that's the only voices you hear in this.
Okay, Honor. You're going to have to explain musical podcast because I think you might have stumbled into like a soundtrack or an album.
Nope.
And I think you might be confused.
There's a separate...
I've never heard of this.
There's a separate album which does have just all the songs, which also, if you were to go and listen to this soundtrack, these songs definitely got... There's a handful of these songs that got very popular on TikTok for a little bit.
Okay.
At least, snippets of them. Because I'm not even on TikTok, and apparently they got so popular that I listened to some of these and was like, oh, I know that sound bit. So this takes place in 3 about 50-minute acts. And in each there's 4 or 5 songs, which means there's 20-25 minutes, if we're being generous, of singing in these. Otherwise, it is a podcast, and the whole it's like a lot of other podcasts we've talked about where sort of part of the premise is that it's being recorded in universe. This is all formatted as a voice recording on Judith's phone. Judith is the name of the female character.
Okay.
Jace is the name of the male character. Except also the female character is also called Natalie. Because when we get into the plot of this podcast, these are 2 people who got married at a certain point. They are ex-husband and wife, but they were married under Judith lying and having this whole fake identity made up where she was Natalie. Jace then found out that she had fake IDs. All of this was fake. She'd lied about who she was, and then he ran off. They're no longer married.
You're already we haven't even got to the plot of this podcast, and you're like blowing my brain right now.
Wait, so this is happening before the podcast?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that happens before the podcast. When that background is given pretty quickly, because this podcast begins, and like I said, it's a voice recording on Judith's phone, and she sort of makes some vague remarks about recording it for her future self, or for the phrase "for the record" or "on the record" is said a lot. She talks about the record. And so she is driving to this house in the middle of just absolute nowhere. And it's where Jace pretty much ran off to, is the way they keep phrasing it. Because he found out about all this and just ran. like just left, didn't really try to resolve anything. And so she pretty much shows up at his door and just knocks and is like, hey, let's try something. And so she has brought with her the 36 questions, which are part of, I believe, an actual experiment type thing. There's research based on it, but it's these 36 questions that are designed to very quickly like deepen a relationship and understanding between two people. And they kind of say, especially Judith says, they asked each other these questions before early on in their relationship, and that's how they fell in love, kind of. And so she's like, let's do the questions again. Now you know who I am, so through these questions, I'll answer honestly, and you can get to know me again, kind of. So she's showing up trying to repair things.
Yeah, so her goal is to like win him back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but we don't know why she's had fake personalities and personas.
Yeah. Nope.
Do we learn?
Not yet. We learn over the course of this podcast. So, I will list all the songs just because I think they're helpful points to kind of see how this plot goes. The first song is Hear Me Out, and it is a song that Judith sings literally like yelling through the door to the house of being like, actually physically let me in. The mosquitoes are eating me up. Can I come into the house, please? I drove all the way out here. And also like, just hear me out, because he did just like run off and didn't really resolve things with her. A lot of the explaining of kind of the exposition of this podcast is pretty obvious. It's a little on the nose, which I think some people might not like, but I think they do a pretty good job of making it happen naturally. And especially, I think combining it with musical, because musicals are often so overt with saying, here's what's happening, here's the emotions on the table. I think it melds really well. But it's definitely a big part of the beginning of this podcast. The next song is sung by Jace, and it's called One Thing, and it's kind of a song about his to-do list with fixing up this house that he's ran off to. That is, I believe, his childhood home, but it's like kind of in shambles now. But it's also about like the number one thing on his list that he keeps saying is like forgetting about Judith, moving on. It's pretty quickly and like from their mouth established that Judith wants to ask these 36 questions because she thinks they'll get through them and they'll fall in love again and get back together. Jace kind of agrees to do the 36 questions because he kind of says to himself, if I can get through these 36 questions, I'll remember all the ways she lied to me and I'll be cemented in moving past her.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Quick timeout. What an insane premise for this podcast.
Yeah.
What? Who? What? I don't...
It's
what?
wild.
And so, is the whole pod them just in this cabin?
No. It moves around.
What?
We're going to keep going.
This is weird, dude. It's too weird, man.
It's awesome. It is crazy how it starts out, and I get it. I was thinking some of the same things when I started listening to it, and I was like, this is crazy. What is the story that's about to happen? If all this has already happened, what's going to happen now? And it is honestly really impressive how they move through the processing of that, and actually the interesting part of the story.
By all means, continue.
Yes. The next song is called Natalie Cook, which is the fake name that Judith used to go by. And she pretty much says she has this big envelope that she brought. And she says, Jace, open this. And he eventually agrees. A lot of this is like he very begrudgingly, because he's like, I don't want to do this. We're not getting back together. He ends up agreeing. And so he opens this envelope, and it's all of her fake documentation, her fake IDs. And she pours a bunch of lighter fluid on it and like hands him a matchbook and says, let's like light this thing on fire. It's kind of like a ritual thing. In my notes about this song, I said awesomely eerie, because I really love the sound of this song.
That makes sense for you. Yeah.
And a lot of songs sound like that. I really love that sound. I also just think it does really rock the way they do it. This whole like musical sound and tone of it is very kind of folksy, kind of indie. There's a little bit of jazz sound to it, which I just think meshes really well with kind of the podcast tone of things. But yeah, she is like, let's light this on fire. And then Jace eventually is like, you know what? Screw it. Sure, I'll do your little ritual. And then the very next song is called Judith Ford, which is her real name. She ends up showing him the passport with her real name, which has kind of an emotional weight for him, because it's like, here's like a piece of paper with the truth on it. She is kind of pushing more toward like answering the rest of the 36 questions at this point. Another of my notes I had says really good distance, because this whole thing is recorded, like the candid sound of it is that it's recorded on a phone, and they do it really well, where you can hear when characters are like walking around the house and they're not the one holding the phone, or sometimes they drop the phone in certain instances.
I love that you're like, they've done a really good job at making it sound bad.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like they just drop the phone randomly. It's like sometimes a thing happens that they drop the phone.
Yeah.
There's a point where Jace like just starts yelling really far away, and it's really funny. You just hear him in the distance. It's really funny. Yeah, they end up outside, I think, as Jace kind of wanted to get away from things, and he walks outside and it just starts pouring. And like the sound of it, the sound design is so well done. Incredibly well produced.
Do you know the production company for this one?
I was about to say 2 Up is the studio that puts this on.
Oh, I thought you meant like Hawk to. I was like, that's before the time.
2 Up. Listen to our other episode where we talk about Talk to Up.
Amazing podcast.
Oh, okay.
That's
not
you
true.
love to
Very
lie.
bad podcast.
You love
She got a podcast.
I know.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I also put in my notes that there's a duck, because like I said, there's a duck, Henry, that Jace has picked up and is taking care of.
Oh.
He's around and he's really awesome. They love him.
So does the duck talk, or does it just go?
It just quacks. It quacks a
He
lot.
talks.
Oh,
And
okay.
it's-
Talks duck language.
Yeah.
You know?
It speaks like a duck does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marissa,
Yeah.
you were so understanding about that. You're like, yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a duck.
Duh. Yeah. Yeah. So the last song in this first act is called For the Record, and it's the first time we hear just Jace. Judith has left her phone kind of in the living room, and she's gone to change shirts because she got soaked through in the rain. And so we hear just Jace for the first time, and that's kind of when he says very explicitly that he's only wanting to go through these 36 questions because he wants to really cement that he's not getting back together with her. Just a lot of tension that is really well set up. And we also hear more of those motivations and stuff from Judith at the second half of this song. Yeah. And then we get into Act 2. There's a brief in-universe. There's an 8-minute gap between Act 1 and Act 2 because Judith's phone dies and she has to go get a charger.
Are these separate episodes, or is this like...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, separate episodes. Like I said, each act is about 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So the first song in Act 2 is called We Both. And any of these songs are really well done, and I feel like I could talk extensively about any of them, about the just like a more musical analysis side of the really well done narrative kind of structuring of these songs. There's a lot of elements there that are really well crafted. But We Both starts as a song that Judith is singing about comparing Judith and Natalie, these two versions of herself, because they start answering more of the questions, and she's like, my answers for these questions are the same, because Jace is kind of getting annoyed of like, this is the same way you answered them last time, and she's like, I wasn't lying about everything. It's not like I told a lie about every single thing. Just, you know, some important things.
Just the
Just
big
my
ones.
name.
Just the big ones, just my name and who I am. Yeah. So she sings, it's first about her and Natalie and about the things that they both have in common, and then it ends up being about Jace and Judith and the things they share, and the fact that they're not, like, she's not against him, they're not opposition, kind of. The power goes out, and so Jace goes down to the basement to retrieve Judith, who went down there to get some wine for them. Just starting to like have dinner and have
By
a little
candlelight.
wine. She literally lights candles. She like is kind of trying to set the mood, and he's like, "Hey now." She's
Marissa,
like,
I like how into this romance you are.
yeah. I
don't know if I'm pro. I don't know if I'm a fan of them getting together. I gotta hear this though.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're just pro romance.
yeah.
Like, ooh,
I'm
bottle
pro
of
drama.
wine.
Yeah. The drama's good. Judith she's approaching this kind of like, she's like, this is kind of like a second first date because you're getting to know me again. So the power goes out. Like I said, this whole thing is based on Judith recording this on her phone, and her phone's about dead, and now they can't charge it because the power's out. So they end up getting in Jace's truck to charge it because she can plug it in there, and so they start like driving around. They answer more questions, and then I think probably the most popular song that people would have probably heard from this is called Our Word. And it happens after one of the 36 questions is about like your upbringing, like would you change anything about the way you were raised? And the first time Judith or Natalie said that she wished her parents were still alive. This time she says she wishes everything was different, and Jace goes, wait, your parents could be alive. Are your parents alive? And she goes, yes. She lied about all that, but then Our Word is about her upbringing and her relationship with her parents, and it's this very sinister song where she talks about, it starts with this anecdote about when she broke a ship in a bottle that was in her dad's office, and her mom says, if we both say, oh no, we don't know how this happened, but we weren't even in the house, it's our word against his. That's that's what the song's about. And it gets more and more sinister. I think there's one point where Judith says, there's 3 times that I went to my parents, my life was almost ruined, I was crying, and they like patched it up. And she talks about like people being paid to make things go away. She gives kind of 2 examples, kind of like the ship in a bottle format, where it's implied that like something was found in their boat that was like incriminating, and they were like, we don't even know how that got there. And she says something about, we didn't even see this person the day we died, maybe implying she killed someone and her parents helped cover it up. That's never talked about again, by the way.
Awesome.
And she says 3 times and then only lists 2 things.
Oh.
But the last part of this song is that she talks about when she was 26, she moved to New York. She says she got into drugs. She wasn't doing well. And she says that she got high one night and was taking a bath and realized that she like couldn't keep her head above water. And she sings about like thinking about if she died, and these sort of like hypothetical quotes that she's making up for her parents of the lies they might tell about her not having been her daughter, of them not having known her, of them having had a good relationship with her, which they didn't. It's definitely hinted at that they were abusive in various ways. And then after that, she's like, yeah, so I was medically dead for 3 minutes of my life. And Chase is like, wow, I didn't know any of this.
That's crazy.
So this is a huge moment where they're like, okay, that's crazy. But it's also a moment of Judith like having been really honest with Jace, and he appreciates that because he's like, no, you didn't tell me any of this before, and that's like really hard stuff to talk about. You're talking about it now.
Okay, I need a timeout because over here in Sam and Marissa land, I think we're trying to decide whether we want this like romance to go through or not.
Oh yeah.
I'm now strictly opposed. She's crazy. She's crazy and like a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't
No, no go.
I mean,
no go on romance.
going to his house when he said, leave me alone.
Oh,
That's
for sure.
That's strike 1. That's stalker
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah.
That's red flags. But then maybe it's love. I'm pro rom-com.
Maybe it's love.
I'm pro throwing rocks at windows, until
I don't know.
Yeah. It's also, at this point, Jace is not
Intriguing.
like, oh, I've forgiven you, but he's like, this also makes sense of this whole foundation of your parents lying about everything, and like telling you to lie about things all the time to save everyone's skin.
But what if
about
this is a lie?
whatever. But what if this is a lie?
Whoa,
That's
that
a
would be
constant
genius.
question through this whole thing. And actually, because they end up going down to the ocean, because they'd been driving around, and that's where she says all of this. Actually, no, they go down to the ocean. There's a next song as they kind of answer more questions called A Better Version. And it's Judith singing about the first time she met Jace and sort of the initial spur of the moment reason that she lied, because she was like, I can make a better version of myself and my life. And it ended up not just being a one-time interaction with him, but she loved that she didn't have to have all the bad things that she'd had. And kind of talks about like being able to be happier. And is just very honest about that and about how much she loved like living with Jace and being with Jace. And then Jace kisses her.
No.
After this song.
Yuck,
What if she's just
boo.
manipulating him?
I mean, it doesn't matter. She's crazy. Period. End of sentence. Get
And
out
she
of
maybe
there.
killed a guy.
She truly never addressed again. It's like, did she kill that guy? Did her parents kill that guy?
I'm about
She
to kill
definitely
them.
says, like, outright that her parents paid to make things go away.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so clear through the song that she sings that there were bad things going on.
She's a daughter of the mob.
Yeah, they must have been
Yeah,
rich. Her name must
they
be
were rich.
Googleable. Like, why else would she change it?
Marissa, I would pay like $10 for you to say Googleable again.
Googleable?
I just really liked it. Because I thought you really meant her name was Googleable. Like her name was Judith Googleable.
Judith Googleable.
I just thought it was funny. The way that word moves is funny to
Yeah.
me.
It's a
It's
good
a
word.
good one. Yeah.
Okay, so do they hate each other? Do they fall in love?
Well, they just kissed.
I'm dying.
They just kissed. They end up... Judith has been kind of jokingly, kind of not, suggesting that they go to a motel this whole time. The recording of the phone gets dropped on the beach and then stops and comes back like 20, 30 minutes later, and they're in a motel and they're both like kind of drunk.
Oh, no.
She's going to stab him.
I
She's going to
still-
stab him, take his kidneys.
Yeah.
Kill him.
Why is she recording it? That's what I'm still...
That's the question for sure.
Oh, you got to give us answers. I'm going to explode over here. I need
So-
answers quickly.
Yeah, so they keep going through more of the questions. I can't remember exactly. Oh, I think it's what do they value in a friendship? And Judith very pointedly answers dependability because Jace ran away. And he very pointedly answers honesty because she lied to him. So that kind of happens. They both kind of start to sober up a little bit and they start fighting, and Jace is like, I think he says something about needing a moment off the record, kind of jabbing at whatever she's doing, and he ends up getting in the truck and leaving. Which again, he runs away. She literally doesn't have a car. She's in this motel in the middle of nowhere. And so, yeah, she gets left, which happens after a song called Reality, where Jace admits to still loving her, but says he can't get back together with her, and is like, we have to like wake up, like, no, this isn't gonna happen, this doesn't work. Then we get to Act 3. This resumes at 1 p.m. the next day while Judith is walking along the highway,
Oh.
because what else is she gonna do? She got stranded at that motel.
No car.
So she is left alone with the recording again and starts kind of talking to her future self and gives a little kind of vaguely maybe more of a sense of why she's recording. And there's just something about her being honest and it being captured in this recording that she seems to value. Again, it's still vague at this point, but you get a little more insight into that. She ends up getting back to his house. She walks all the way there. It's like 10 miles or something. And it's kind of where they started exactly at the beginning, and she's like yelling questions at him through the door on his porch, and he just grabs Henry the Duck and gets in his truck and leaves again. Third time.
That's pretty
Drives
epic.
off. And so she like starts crying on his porch, and pretty much she asks herself all of the rest of the questions. And so now they're all recorded on this thing. And she sings a song called Answer 36. And one point in particular that she has like a printed copy of these questions that she's taken with her the whole time. And it's just, there's not like a line of dialogue about it. She doesn't sing about it, but you can very pointedly hear her crumple up this paper and throw it away. And there's a lot of details like that in the sound design that are really well done in the atmosphere and being able to hear actions that are important, but they aren't overstated necessarily. It's really well done. But she actually then in question 36 is, if I remember correctly, it's about like sharing a problem that you have and want a solution for. And her kind of issue that she says is that she wants, which this feels crazy because it seems like this isn't what she was wanting. She sings about letting go of Jace. So then there's this interesting, it's kind of flipped over the course of this podcast where we just had a song where Jace is like, I still love you. Jace has, even though this whole time he said he doesn't want to see her at all, he's answered these questions and done these things. And he was the one to kiss her. And Judith is by herself and she's like, I've answered all the questions. I need to move on. How do you do that? But I'm going to. And so she puts her phone in his mailbox and says this record is for him. Which is like, whoa. Because she says she doesn't need it anymore.
It's also a really expensive record. Like you can just get like
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
voice recorder.
This is set in, gosh, I don't remember the year. This is an iPhone 1. They say outright. So it's not a modern cell phone.
I don't know if it has that much storage.
Nah, who knows?
Facts.
Yep.
Facts. I don't know if the microphone can pick me snapping.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yep. But yeah, Jace eventually comes back. He picks up the phone and we hear little bits of him recording himself saying, at first he says, I'm going to throw this phone away. I'm not going to listen to it. Then he says, no, I'm going to mail it back to you. That's kind of an expensive thing to throw away, like you guys are saying.
Facts. Facts.
Yep. And then he eventually, he's like, shoot. And he listens to it. And then we hear him pick it up and record a year later when he says he's listened to it again. And he sings this song called Listen Back, where it's the like him coming back a year later and he's like, I listened to it again. And he, like I said, it's this huge reversal where we hear in the song Question 36, Judith talking about how she has to let go of him and move on. And Listen Back is all about Jace still holding on to this and saying that he still loves her. And after the 1 year mark, we hear him 4 years later, picking up the recording again and saying he listened back again. And he was in a relationship with someone else between this point. He has a kid. The kid's name is Cooper. He's really cute. And eventually he says, I can't just keep listening to it again. I got to do something. And so he sings a song called Attachment where he emails Judith. He manages to find her email and he answers the last handful of questions that he didn't answer on the record and he sends them to her. And he gets a response and she's like, they've updated the 36 questions and you're supposed to end by staring into each other's eyes for 4 minutes. So I think you should tell me these answers in person and we can actually finish it. She's like, I move around for work and I'll be around Sunday. I can make a time work. And he's like, okay.
Is he still dating this other person?
No, they were separated. They have this kid together, but they get a separation at some point. It's unclear if it's married and divorced, but yeah. He's like, I have Cooper on the weekends or whatever. And so they end up meeting up. They go through these questions. And for the last question, like when she was like, my issue, my problem I need solved is how to let go of you, he says the same thing and is like, how do I let go of you? And it's very interesting hearing her in this last interaction, because there does seem to be this distance, and like she's very kind to him, and there's like such a sympathy to her voice and the way she sounds, of being like, because she asked the same thing when she first did all this. It was her way of being able to let go, and now seems like kind of helping him through that. And yeah, and she just kind of says, like, just live, you just keep going. And the second part of the last question is reflect back to the partner who just said what their problem is, how they seem to be feeling about it. And she says, "You seem ready." And then he goes, "Huh?" And she goes, "Ready to look in my eyes for 4 minutes." And so they do that. It's also interesting, they're talking at some point, and it's interesting that Cooper is there because he couldn't find a sitter. So this kid Cooper ends up coming along, and he's about 5, and he keeps asking these like questions like a kid does, where they just kind of keep asking why. And so it's really interesting to hear Jace be like, how do I even explain this? And it makes him articulate things, and it makes him reflect on things. And at one point he says Judith's name, and she tells him to call her Natalie.
Yuck. I don't like that
Interesting.
at all.
Well, it's just not like, oh, call me Natalie, but it's like she corrects him, kind of. Where it's like, it seems like she's living
Like she is.
as Natalie. Yeah. And so they sing a last song called The Truth. And it's, like I said, Cooper's asking all these questions, and he, at one point ends up asking, like, because they're talking about the truth and when people lie and when they don't. And he's like, why would you ever not tell the truth? And basically Jace ends up, it's like interesting. He explains to Cooper that sometimes the truth is hard. And then Natalie, Judith, is sitting right there listening while he's kind of finally coming to grips in a way with, like, even if they're not going to get back together, it's not like it's a fine thing that she did, but like he understands through all of these events unfolding why it might be hard, why it's hard to tell the truth, and why you might lie. And she joins in the song at a certain point, and they're kind of both reflecting on things, and then that's the musical. The record ends.
Wow.
That's the musical podcast. And it's so good.
So bad, dude.
No!
Okay, hold on.
It's awesome!
No way, bro.
It's so good.
Whatever.
It's a little manipulative.
It's
but
there's nothing
Here's the
nothing there.
thing.
The story's not. There's
No,
this.
it's
Whatever,
not
man.
about-
It's a whack.
No,
it's
no.
about the feelings, the emotional
Whatever.
roller coaster.
It's not even necessarily.
I thought we were gonna go somewhere.
No, it's not even necessarily about the feelings. It's about, like, the consideration of why you might lie about certain things, why you would run away from things, how you deal with when people hurt you, how you deal with when people love you and when you love them.
And those are all really human themes. Like,
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah, and there's interesting intersections. I also think, which this is also, I come from a musical theater background. I love thinking about how musicals, because it is interesting that most of this show is very diegetic sound of, this is supposed to be a literal recording on someone's phone. You can hear when stuff falls or when people are too far away from the mic. But then a musical, people aren't actually usually singing in the universe of the story. And it's not quite literal, and you kind of wonder, okay, how much of this is what truly happened and how much isn't, and there's interactions kind of with that and those layers. There is also there's not constant music through the podcast, but there is kind of background music in some points where that part isn't necessarily diegetic or literal. But there also is music in the background at one point, and then Jace goes, "Can you turn off the record?" And the music stops. So then there's kind of an interesting question of, they're kind of toying the whole time with this idea of like what's true, what isn't, how much is a lie, what is the lie. And it's really well done.
What would you rate this podcast?
I would rate this podcast pretty high. There's certain points where maybe it's a little heavy-handed on exposition or something, but honestly, not a lot to hate. It's also incredibly well acted, and the music is beautiful. These are both Broadway actors. Yeah. It's so good. I would say like a 4 or 4.5. It's really well done.
That's high praise, man. That's high praise. We're entering Wolf 369 territory.
Yeah, it's close. It's also, it's not a long listen, so definitely recommend if you're like, I've got a 3-hour car drive, you can listen to it all. And you can also just listen to the music. They have the albums.
Speaking of a 3-hour car drive, I've got one soon. And Marissa, what should I listen to while I do it?
Yeah.
Okay, well...
You brought a podcast.
The podcast I've brought is quite different than these other two.
Yeah.
It's called Two Hot Takes by Morgan Absher. Have either of you ever heard of it?
You mentioned it briefly to me.
Yes.
But I don't know it.
So, this is a really fun podcast. The host, she is from Minnesota. She formerly worked as a PT, and then she actually an occupational therapist, not a physical therapist. So she worked as an OT, moved to LA to live with her dad, and just has some really like interesting life stories. Just some background on her. Like, her dad is not her real dad, and then neither are any of her siblings. Like, they all share a mom, but she talks about it. It's really interesting.
Okay.
But the main idea is they're giving hot takes. And you want to know on what?
What?
Reddit stories.
Yeah.
So it's a Reddit podcast. It's a read Reddit story podcast.
Originally it started out as, and you're going to have to bleep me out. It originally started out as, Am I the Apple? Reddit story podcast. So they'd give the takes, like, who's wrong in this situation, who's correct, what should we do about it? So it started out as that.
Marissa, just real quick, the host is, what's her name?
Morgan Absher.
And then there's somebody else there?
So she typically has different people. So sometimes it's her boyfriend, now fiance, Justin, who he's a music producer. So he made like all the sound and audio. Sometimes it's one of her friends from Minnesota who now lives in LA with her. Sometimes she brings in guests. And then a lot of the time it was her dad.
Okay.
But it was, like I said, this all started, like, originally she was an occupational therapist, wasn't loving her job. So all during COVID, she's like, what if I start a podcast? I really like reading these stories. So her and her friends started this podcast. It started real small, and now it's huge. Her dad has his own podcast. Her brother and her sister-in-law have their own podcast. Whoa. And it's a whole little podcast family. But this is the main one. This is probably the best one, the most well-known. But yeah, it's been really interesting.
So do they just read off the story and then they're like, I can't believe it. This person is awful.
No, it's like typically really good advice. So they choose stories that she knows what the story is going to be. No one else does. So she'll read them aloud for the first time. Hasn't read the verdict. I don't know if you've ever read a Reddit story on AITA, but basically by Reddit's voting system, someone will assign, okay, either you're in trouble, this person's yeah. Well, you gotta bleep it out, right?
Yeah, I know, but I was. That's what you were trying to say,
right? And so whatever has the most votes, that's the verdict. And so sometimes they disagree, and that's where the hot takes come in. So they typically give advice, and then it moved from that to also using the Reddit relationship advice, and then there's also listener submissions. Sometimes there's things from like No Sleep or anything on Reddit, it might get read on here. And then there's also those listener submissions on their own subreddit.
Gotcha.
So it's really interesting. There's lots of advice, lots of fun things. Like there's been a couple of really interesting guests, like Drew Offawallo. She hosts her own podcast. Okay. Swell Entertainment has been another good one. the father, his podcast is Father Knows Best, and it's all user submissions.
Okay.
And so he
That's
gives
awesome.
advice for people who, might not have a dad to talk to,
Okay.
because none of his kids are biologically his own.
Sure.
So he's really interested in giving back. And then the sibling, the brother and his wife, theirs is Midwest married, so they talk a lot about parenting and marriage and living in the Midwest.
So these are all so when you say like, a Reddit, like, am I the asshole situation, I think of like, to me, what's fun about those is you get to judge people. You get to be like, this person's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But this seems to be like an empire built on giving people advice. Like, this is what you want to do in your relationship. Like, that's the kind of the angle.
Some of them are definitely like, oh, here's a piece of advice. And some of them are, there's this infamous poop knife story. And basically what happens is am I the asshole for being like, you can't have a poop knife in our bathroom?
What does that mean?
What does that entail?
I see how this is good content. I get it.
Yeah.
And so I guess you'll just have to listen to that specific story.
Oh my God.
But there's a lot of different things like that. So some of them are funny. Some of them are just off the wall. Like, oh, today I found out that my boyfriend's been poisoning me with millipedes.
Is that real? Is that?
Some of them have been proven.
Wow.
Whoa.
So pretty crazy things. There's been a couple of episodes where they've had really hot takes and have had to like give apologies, like, oh, hey, we weren't thinking about the consequences of what we said here, or our guest wasn't really thinking.
I mean, that's dedication.
Right.
That's hot takes.
Some of them are
takes.
hot, like on fire. There's been one episode where they found all of the other side to the stories. So, like when you blow up on Reddit or Twitter or something and you're like, this happened to me. And then the other person that's involved in the story is like, actually, here's how it went.
Yeah.
So sometimes that happens. So they had a whole episode like looking at the other side. So lots of advice, lots of crazy stories. And then sometimes just some really like interesting anecdotes. So like I said, she originally didn't plan to be a podcaster. She was in occupational therapy, has a lot of stories about working with different people with disabilities, talks a lot about sex therapy. So that's like a little minor point.
Reminds me of Call Her Daddy, which is a podcast I just talked about, which, that was the angle for that podcast. It was initially a sex podcast. There's some ways to like drum up interest in that. I can see that. Well, and also I feel like that fits with like the Reddit story. I'm not saying making Reddit story content is lazy, but I am saying it is an easy way to get
because you already
interesting
have stories
and like interesting content.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are gravitating to it as compared to like other things, because like Smosh has their own Reddit story podcast.
Yeah.
But I think people really like the personality, since she is from the Midwest, has that like more humble background. A lot of the stories are like, oh yeah, I'm about to go feed my horses and I've been thinking about this.
We all know how the Midwest is with their horses.
Yeah.
I mean,
If you go a
don't
little
you
more
have
south,
horses?
that is how it goes.
Many horses.
I have no horses.
I actually am a horse. That's why I had to get a podcast, because they wouldn't let me on TV.
I truly would not co-host with you if you were a horse. So
Yeah, you gotta.
Hey!
Was that your impression of Honor saying no if I was a horse, or was that your impression of me as a horse?
That was my impression
That's
of
you.
a horse.
I
As a
thought that
horse.
was you. I thought that was Honor being like, "No, I won't do that with. I won't podcast with you."
Like-
you know,
yeah, for sure.
that makes a lot of sense.
No.
But yeah. Any other questions on that?
Yeah. So this is a podcast you enjoy.
Yes. I would
What do
say
you? Yeah.
I go through phases. So this is my plane. I'm on the plane. I need something to listen to get through a
Mm.
flight.
Sure.
Or like, I'm really tired. I've got to fall asleep to something.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
But so is it for you? You're like, man, I really want advice right now, or is it? I want to hear like the most. Insane
I want to
things
hear
on
the
internet.
most insane
Yeah,
story.
got it,
Right.
got it.
Right.
That was what I was like. It feels like they're leaning into this advice thing, but is it really an advice podcast? You know, what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
And there are advice elements, but it is more about the crazy off the wall stories.
Sure.
Like a wife who lied about her identity to her husband for 2 years.
Exactly.
Crazy that really happened.
No, I think there was recently something similar to that. Or there was
What?
last night I fell asleep to an episode talking about this husband. He had been cheating on the wife, right? He ends up having a baby with whoever he was cheating on with. So they get a divorce. He has the baby. The day the baby is due, the wife is like, I have your dog tag from the military. Come pick it up at my house. And then so she staged a whole thing where it looked like he was cheating on the new girl. And she was the baby mom was like, you're not seeing our son ever again. Or you're not seeing our son at all because she just had a child.
Can I just say that's genius?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I support her.
This is not a hot take podcast. You know, my takes usually come out ice cold, right? But
Except those musical takes.
Except those musical
takes. And also most other ones.
Yeah, it's true. But so I'm not supporting, you ruining, your ex-lover's life, but I do think it's awesome. I think that's kind of rad that she did that. Wow, that's so insane. So that's the appeal. You're like,
right.
You're learning about the insane people of the world.
And it's fun.
But this is also like your comfort podcast. Like this is the one you're putting on.
I think so. I don't know if you all feel the same way. Like
No,
I like to see podcasts on a screen. I'm not a good listener.
Oh.
So I started out watching this on YouTube.
Sure.
And then eventually,
it's a video
YouTube
podcast.
takes up a lot of data.
Yeah.
So I was like, I guess I have to listen to it as a podcast now.
Sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but I definitely do understand that concept of like the comfort pod. That like I don't necessarily need to hear everything for it, but I will just like knock out to.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of us are big video podcast people.
No.
Some people need that though. Some people need that video part of it.
I used to be scared of regular podcasts. I was like, I don't like voices coming from the void. I need something to associate it with.
Honestly,
I love that.
maybe I get that.
Because like
Maybe it makes it make more sense now. Why some people are like, I really need the video.
It's the void. They're afraid of the void.
the void, and then also like not knowing who the speaker is. Like imagine that you picture this person in your head, and then you see a real life picture of them, and you're like, "This is what I expected."
Oh, we
You feel
talk about-
catfished.
We talk about face shock all the time.
It's the worst.
We just prefer. We're like, we don't want to know.
Yeah,
Right.
There's guys that I've listened to for years. Like for all like the majority of my teenage years.
Yeah.
And I have refused to like Google them. Like, if I think that I might physically see them, I avoid it.
Yeah.
It's a whole thing.
There's fully people who I've listened to on podcasts and I really love their voice, and then I have seen pictures of them and there's so much cognitive dissonance I don't remember what those pictures look like.
That's awesome.
Truly blanked it out. So I'm like, you're just a voice.
Marissa, this podcast, the 2 Hot Takes, Marissa, I feel like 2 Hot Takes might get boring after a while. You said that sometimes you switch it out, you go through cycles. Do you feel like if you listen to a lot after a while, it just is like blah, like you're like, it's too much of the same, or does it does it stay fresh for you?
I feel like it stays fresh just because there are a lot of guest co-hosts.
Sure.
Because it's never just Morgan the host. It's always someone else. Whether that's, like I said, the fiance. So even if the stories are boring, there's always new things going on in their life.
Gotcha.
And maybe this is my own hot take. I watch things as fast as I possibly can. I listen to things as fast as I possibly can.
You're a 2-time speeder. Yeah,
I'm with you.
What
you guys
is
know.
that?
Hey, I listened to
3x
this one on
sometimes.
regular speed because it's musical.
Right.
Honor,
I have taste about it.
are you not a 1-time speed person?
You know this about me. No, dog.
I did. What do you mean? What?
We've
It's
talked
too
about
slow.
this.
For talking podcasts, it is too
Regular.
What is your normal speed? If you're listening to a normal podcast, what's your normal speed?
Probably 1.5.
This is sacrilege. You can't do this.
No,
You can't skim through the Bible and get the whole thing. Okay, I'm just saying.
That's not what I'm doing.
Like
And
if
if
you want to get a good podcast experience, you got to listen to.
if it's a podcast where I'm like the speed matters, I need it to be. I'm not against listening to it on regular speed. I do know some people
you're
who are like
through life. You're like Adam Sandler and Click the movie.
I listen to more podcasts than you.
That's true.
That's pure. That
I get a
doesn't
lot of
matter.
content in.
Just because you get more.
You can get through more. That's how you listen to all of Critical Role Campaign 2 in like 6 months.
That's a separate problem. Okay, that one, that's not real. That's a bad podcast.
I watched the whole season of a TV show in one day because I have an extension that lets me watch up to 16 times speed. I don't ever go up to that, but
what's your highest?
4. 4 is like a good.
But can you?
Man, I've done 3. 4 is impressive.
Yeah.
What is fun about that?
4 does feel wild.
I don't have enough time in the day.
Then I don't. Then you watch less. You know, you watch better content that you're like, haha, instead of being like. That's you laughing faster, you know. Like, I don't think it works that way.
Yeah, man.
Okay.
I am staunchly on the one-time speed side of the time wars, the speed wars.
Mm-hmm.
Wow,
this is ridiculous.
Even like sleep podcasts, I listen to faster.
Your brain's got to slow down. You'll never fall asleep. Your brain will keep going fast. You're in warp drive all the time.
You're just saying, Marissa's the busiest person you know.
This is crazy. This is deeply
I'm going to listen to
this
this one fast.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Listener, you have to slow down podcast. You have to increase our
0.25.
consumption hours.
You have to listen in. You have to email in at podpodcastpod@gmail.com and let us know how fast you listen to a podcast.
That is true. You should email in. I thought you were like, I don't know. I thought you were like having a stroke or maybe falling asleep while talking. You're like, you gotta make sure.
When you do so fast, you could do anything.
Oh, I love that. That's such a good clip.
Yeah.
Marissa, how would you rate 2 Hot Takes? It sounds like you enjoy this podcast, but I don't know if is it a great or a good podcast? You know, where does that land?
I would say a 4.
Whoa. This is solid.
There's a couple times, so they did a couple of live shows, very interesting. Sometimes they'll tease stories, so at the end she'll be like, would you rather hear A or B to her guest? And whichever one doesn't get chosen goes on Patreon. And no offense, I'm not, as much as I love anything, I'm not paying for it.
No.
I'm a cheapskate.
It's also awesome that like the less interesting stories go on Patreon. You know, the ones that the guests didn't pick.
Right. And sometimes they are really interesting.
Okay.
Or like the titles are really interesting.
Sure.
Like my mother-in-law crashed my wedding. Like things like that.
Now, you're right. It is interesting. I'm like, what does that mean? What's up with that?
I guess we'll never know.
Interesting. But it's
Unless
a good podcast. It's in the upper echelon.
Right.
Perhaps if I ever want a Reddit podcast, that's the one I should go to. Although I've heard from my roommate that after Podcast plays, it always plays Smosh Reddit stories,
which is really fun.
That's
really funny.
So perfect. That sounds like a lovely podcast.
Yeah.
You know what else is lovely?
Our podcast?
Our podcast, I guess. Sorry.
Such real confusion on Sam's face.
Yeah, that was
you gotta have more faith, dude.
You gotta have more faith. And we gotta have more reviews. You should go leave us a review someplace. Leave us 5 stars. Write a little thing. We'll read it off. I'm about to read a review. You should also send us emails. You can send us email at poppodcastpod@gmail.com. We'll read it off. Let us know if you're a 2 times speed or a 0.5 speed person like me. I take life slowly.
You're just lying now.
That's true. I'm a 1-time speed boy. And let us know what podcast you want. We have got everything planned out through the end of the year, and we would love to hear what you guys want to do for the next year. We're very excited. We got big plans. Yeah. We'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, we got a review. I don't love this one, but they left 5 stars, so I have to read it.
Dang.
The subject line is, "PP heads, rise up."
Oh my gosh.
This podcast is great, and its fan base, parentheses, the PP heads, which is not, we will not use that term.
That's not true.
We will not use that term.
I'll disown you.
Listeners.
I'll hunt you down.
This is not what you're called. We don't have a name for you, and I'm resisting.
If anyone's got a better idea, you could tell us. We might like it.
Leave a review. Send an email. It's not PP heads. I like pod. We could do PPCC-ers, you know?
Yeah, pod.
That kind of sounds like the CP.
I like podlings or something.
Or CCP.
Oh, yeah. The Chinese Communist Party. We're associated. Xi Jinping, hit us up. We will promote the Chinese Communist Party on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
This podcast is great, and its fan base, parentheses, the PP heads, parentheses, is a wonderful community of awesome people. Join the ranks of the PB heads and listen to and love this podcast. Yellow heart, rock emoji, sunglasses emoji. So thank you for leaving that. We disagree strongly
thanks, I guess.
with your terms, your demonym for the audience, but thank you for that. If you leave a 5-star review or an email, we'll read it out.
Yeah.
Perfect. That's another wonderful episode of Pod Podcast Cast.
Let's go.
Everybody go follow and subscribe to us on wherever you're listening to this podcast. Honor, thank you for podding with me.
Thank you.
Marissa, thank you for podding with us.
Thank you for having me.
Marissa, where can the good people of the internet find you?
You can find me on Instagram. If you really like reviews, you can follow me at Marissa's with 2 S's .reviews.
Hey, you said Marissa's with 2 S's. You mean Marissa with 2 S and then
And
S.
then yeah.
Yeah, okay.
MARISSA.reviews.
Where you review predominantly food?
Food, sometimes skincare. People don't like that as much, but I don't know. You can sometimes win free skincare from the account. So
Whoa.
That's awesome.
I know what I got to do with my putrid face. I got to go to Marissa's reviews and get this figured out. Perfect. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Honor. Listener, thank you. And until next time, keep listening.
Keep listening.
Bye.
Bye.